Medieval England was a feudal society, meaning it was based around the ownership of land, which was the main source of wealth at that time. The feudal system was introduced to England by Richard and John's great-grandfather, William the Conqueror, after he conquered England following the Battle of Hastings in 1066. He brought it to England from France, where it had been in use since the 8th century to help kings to raise armies and rule their kingdoms. All land ultimately belonged to the king, and the feudal system provided a legal framework for the king to distribute land to his barons, who in turn distributed their land to knights. The knights allowed peasants to live on their land in return for labour services. Everyone in the feudal system had the duty to protect the people under them in the hierarchy, and the obligation to provide services to the person above them. These rights and obligations were reinforced by oath-taking ceremonies to bind the king, barons, knights and peasants to each other. It became a religious duty to carry out your role in the system. Under the feudal system, the barons were the king's tenants-in-chief. To receive land, they needed to do homage to the king. They would kneel before him and place their hands in his and swear to always be his man. They swore obedience to the king, who in turn promised to always treat them fairly and protect them. By this ceremony, the baron became the king's vassal. He paid taxes to the king, and his most important job was to provide him with knights whenever he needed to raise an army. Also part of the feudal system was the church. Kings gave land to bishops and archbishops, who in return used their influence with the people to insist it was their religious duty to always obey the king. As almost everyone in medieval England was Catholic, this was a powerful method of keeping people loyal to the king. Barons gave land to knights on the same basis they were given land by the king. A similar ceremony was required, with knights doing homage to the baron and swearing to always be the baron's man. The knights were the baron's subtenants and swore obedience to him. The baron in turn promised to always treat the knight fairly and protect him. The knight thereby became the baron's vassal. He paid taxes to the baron and promised to fight for him and the king when required. At the bottom of the feudal pyramid were the peasants, or villeins. They lived on the knight's manor, and in return for a home and land to farm, they performed labour services, working on their own small strips of land 3 or 4 days a week, and the knight's land 2 or 3 days a week. Villeins were the knight's vassals, and could also be asked to go with the knight when he fought for the baron. Medieval villeins were not free. They could not leave the manor without the knight's permission, and many other aspects of their lives were controlled by their feudal lord. A villein could not even marry without the lord's permission. As well as the homage that everyone paid to their feudal lord, which meant it would be considered a great sin to not carry out their duties, there was also forfeiture to keep everyone in line. If anyone failed to carry out their duties, whether they were a baron, knight or villein, their lands were forfeited, leaving them homeless and without an income. For Richard and John, the feudal system provided money and armies, but it was also a potential weakness. With extensive lands in France, they had to ensure that they kept the loyalty of their French barons, who could, if pushed too far, switch their loyalty to the King of France, taking their lands with them. Richard proved to be far more capable of keeping his French barons under control than John did, which was one of the main reasons that John lost most of the lands he had held in France. The feudal system could still work under a weak king, but it needed a strong king to work properly. The feudal system was an inescapable fact of life for most English people under Richard and John, and until well into the 14th century. It took the societal catastrophe that was the Black Death of 1347 to begin the long process that saw it fade away in the 16th century.